We're going to be talking about one of the most highly controversial topics in the Subaru community, in my opinion, and that is stock blocks versus built engines, when you should transfer away from a stock engine to a built motor, and what some of the main differences are between a stock engine and a built motor. I've got a forged connecting rod and forged piston here out of one of my prior cars. This came out of one of my EG33s. The connecting rod is actually an EJ25 connecting rod. The piston is a custom one, but it will still get the concept across. So we're going to tear apart this 2012 STI engine right next to me and compare things over. I want to talk to you guys about some of the main failure points, physically show them to you, so that way you can get a better understanding of what is going to fail in that engine when the time comes. Now, I do want to preface a lot of this, depending on who you talk to and where you go, you will get different answers about this entirely. So I am going to just give you guys the information. I will tell you my ideology behind it, and I will let you make the decision or the deciding factor of when you should go from a stock block over to a built motor. Now, in the past, you guys have seen me push stock motors in the past. My 07 STI was making around 450-ish wheel horsepower on E85 with a Grimspeed BB500 turbo and all the supporting mods there. Before that, we've done 450 wheel on stock blocks on an FP Black on my old 05 STI. So we've messed with these stock blocks enough. We kind of know what they like and what they don't like to an extent. Now, the things that are heavily going to impact the longevity and the lifespan of a stock block is the overall health of it. First of all, if you're buying a used Subaru and you don't actually know the history of the car and you don't know what has all been done to it, you don't know if that's the original engine, you don't know if it's replaced, it's a good starting point to go through and actually check the overall health of the engine. You can do that by doing a compression test and a leak down test. A compression test is going to tell you how strong the compression is in the engine. If you have lower compression in one cylinder over another, you could have valves leaking, piston rings leaking, it could be X, Y, or Z things. But if you do see decreased compression in one cylinder, what you can do from there is a leak down test, and a leak down test is going to tell you exactly where the problem is. If you take off your oil cap while you're doing your leak down test and you hear air coming out of it, it means your piston rings are probably gone. If you hear air coming out of the intake ports, that means that your valve or one of your intake valves isn't seating properly, is bent or damaged. Same can be said about the exhaust. If you hear air coming out of the exhaust while doing the leak down test, that means that you have an exhaust issue. If you see bubbles coming out of your cooling system, that means that your head gasket has been compromised. So it's a good place to start by doing all of this with just a routine checkup on the engine to see what the overall health status is. If your compression check passes and you're solid and you're good to go and you want to make some more power in your engine, by golly gee, let's do it. So the biggest things that are going to impact the lifespan of one of these, a stock engine, is going to be your tuner, what fuel type you're using, what your setup is for your car, and how you drive it. Having a tuner that understands what needs to happen with stock blocks to keep them alive is very important. The biggest thing is keeping torque down a decent amount. As you guys will see when we tear into this engine here and we compare the stock rod over to an actual built or forged connecting rod, you will see the significant difference in size from a stock rod to one of these. When you start pushing them, you do have the possibility of breaking, bending, or damaging a connecting rod. They are not that strong from factory. They are not forged in the EJ25. Some of the older engines that Subaru made, yes, that is a little bit different, but for this video right now, we are talking about EJ25s, some EJ20s for the most part, stock engines. 207, EJ22 and 207, I would say, are kind of like the outliers of this, but most people don't really have 207s too much anymore, and if they do, they're probably not even watching this video. Next up, like I said, is your fuel type. The thing that is 1 second away from killing one of these is one bad knock event. On E85, your resistance to knock is going to be significantly higher than that of pump gas. If you are running pump gas and you have one bad knock event, you heavily risk destroying one of these engines relatively quickly. As we get into it, you guys will see the difference in the ringland design of a built or forged piston versus a stock one. Next up is setup. If you have a setup that is pushing the engine too hard, you do have the possibility of absolutely destroying the engine. You have to keep in mind, cylinder pressure is cylinder pressure. The higher cylinder pressure you have, the worse it is for the engine. If you are running a very small turbo and you are pushing it to high boost levels, you are still going to have higher cylinder pressure. If you can run a bigger turbo, run it at less boost, you're going to have lower cylinder pressure. Lower cylinder pressure is going to keep it alive longer. Cooling is also going to play a huge impact. If you can have more fuel in there, it's going to cool the cylinder more and you're going to be a little bit happier with that engine. So those are just some of the basic parameters of what it is to keep one of these engines alive. So let's start off by getting into the design of the EJ25. Let's cover what the major failure points are if you are going to be pushing a stock block and what to watch out for. Then we'll kind of cover how to remedy that if you are going to push one of these and when you should really start looking at transferring over to a built engine. So the first thing that we're going to compare is the pistons, but we got to get the pistons out of this thing. So Subaru has access holes here going around the engine. I'm going to try to keep my head and my butt out of this as much as possible. That wrist pin clip is gone. Don't know where it just shot out to. Wrist pin clip is out. I normally take a long 3 or 1/4 inch extension, kind of feed it in, and then tap out the old wrist pin. It's coming out now. Just like that. Another wrist pin. With all of our wrist pins removed, we can actually spin this over, if it'll let us, to push the last 2 pistons into the end of the bore. As far as we're going to go. So now that we've got all the wrist pins out, we go ahead and knock the pistons out. So the way I do it, I'll stand this up on its butt, I guess on its side, and there's my extension. And then kind of just knock them out from the inside here and push the pistons out. There's one, we'll get the other ones out all. You can only get to the top of it out. Go ahead and just grab it by the space in the clip and then just kind of pull it out. There's 2. And 4. Let's talk about pistons. Right here we've got a CP piston and right here we've got a factory piston. Now, some of the main differences about these, you're gonna see a difference in the dish type of the piston, just the face of the piston being different. That can be due to designing, that can also change compression ratio, a handful of things, but I'm not gonna get too much into that stuff right now. I just wanna talk about the differences. So this forged piston, what it means to forge a piston. These start out as a single piece of aluminum that are preheated and dyed into a forging press, and then about 2,000 tons of force is used to force these into the die to create the general shape of what you see. Afterwards, they go through and they get machined. So these start out as one piece that are like forced and superheated into a single die and then machined down to just kind of clean them up. Now a stock piston like this is a cast piston. A cast piston is essentially liquid metal that is poured into a die, and then after being poured into a die, you end up with the shape, and then they'll do some cleanup and a little bit of machining to just kind of get the general shape of what they need for the piston. Then they'll apply things like nitrile coatings or things like that around the piston. So this is going to be significantly stronger than this. And having a forged piston, this is going to take to detonation events way stronger and way better than something like this would. If you have 2 equal detonation events, this may be able to withstand it, where this may just crumble and fall apart. Now Subarus are known to have issues with their piston rings. Now if you look at these, you're going to see a couple different rings here. You've got your compression ring, you've got your second ring, and then you've got your oil control ring. If you look at the differences in the rings, you're going to see that the aftermarket piston has a much larger oil control ring and thicker rings for compression. This one's missing a ring. Now Subarus, a lot of people think that the actual piston ring is the problem. It's not so much the ring. Like the gap on Subaru piston rings from the factory isn't the greatest, but what normally ends up breaking is the grooves that support the ring, the actual ring grooves in the piston, and you'll see these crack down to the second compression ring here, and then it will lose compression because that ring can't seal anymore. I mentioned this earlier, with these aftermarket pistons, you're going to see a larger oil control ring. Not only do they have a larger oil control ring, but they also sometimes have additional oil ports added to the piston to help supply oil. Now that's going to aid in cooling as well as lubrication for the aftermarket piston, whereas the stock pistons, yes, they still have journals and porting here that will allow oil to get into them and help lubricate and cool things, but typically with larger porting and additional porting or additional holes, you're going to see better lubrication and cooling out of these. So The main difference that you're gonna get out of a stock piston versus a forged piston is gonna be able to take abuse better, it's going to be able to take it to detonation events better, and it's going to be able to withstand a little bit more. You've also got the thicker or bigger oil control ring on the bottom, and this is gonna heavily depend on which brand piston you get. For me, I normally use CP, JE, or Manley pistons, but most of them are going to have a little bit thicker of an oil control ring or a little bigger oil control ring than you'd get out of a stock piston here. So overall, is the aftermarket piston better? Obviously, it's going to take to abuse better, it's going to take to stress better, and it's going to take it's just going to take more of a beating. Like, this is obviously a better pick. These suck. At the end of the day, they're not the greatest pistons. Now, a lot of people will say, well, the Type RA blocks have a different piston. There's a slight design change from this piston here, which came out of a 2012 STI in a Type RA block, and that is literally just the supports for the wrist pins here. It's a little bit stronger on the RA blocks, but that's really about it. The ring gap is the same. All of that is pretty much the same. There's a slightly different metallurgy to it, but the main thing that you're going to see on an RA block from a non-RA block for pistons is a revised ring support here, or revised wrist pin support here. So now we've kind of covered pistons real quick, let's get into our connecting rods. To get the connecting rods out, we actually have to split the case for the engine to get those out. So let's get this thing open real quick. Let's get our crankshaft and our connecting rods out, and we can compare those over to a aftermarket one. I've already gone through and broken free a lot of these case bolts, so we're just gonna kind of zap them out and get this thing separated. There's a series of them going around the engine. I've already broken them apart in order. But at this point, they should all zap out. So I'm just gonna zap them. They're all loose. That should be all of them. Grab a magnet. All right, so I already got the back one, yeah. So with all of the case bolts out, I'm gonna go ahead and split this thing open. I like to do it from the back like a happy birthday party and just wedge something in here where it's a non-critical surface or non-critical sealing edge. And you'll see the case just start to split open like that. From there, drive this guy down a little bit, just at a dowel. And then tap it on each side of the bell housing. Flip it around, rotate it to the front. You can pound off of this and here. Careful here. There it goes. All right, so cases are split. That's gonna come apart. So we can actually just pull off that side. There's one of our bearings. This thing was actually starting to suffer from bearing failure also. 2 and 4, funny enough. So the cases are something else that we're gonna be talking about here. But yeah, this thing was starting to go from bearing failure. There's a main bearing that just fell out. So I'm gonna set this side of the case aside for right now. Take off the remain seal, probably make it a little easier to lift. And crankshaft out. We got a case here. Ooh, brother, I don't love that. Number 2 and number 4 looks like they're starting to spin. That's a fun time. But we got our crank here. These bearings, I'm gonna set these aside because this is something else that I do want to talk to you guys about, are the bearings, because that's another common failure point on these cars is the bearings. Typically it's a rod bearing over a main bearing, but regardless, it's still a good thing to talk about. So let me set these cases aside real quick and let's get into the connecting rods. Right here we've got the factory STI connecting rod, and we have an aftermarket Manley H Tough series connecting rod. You guys can already see right off the bat that the Manley is much thicker than the factory one. Similar to what we talked about earlier with the pistons, the Manley connecting rod here is a forged connecting rod. Means that it gets pressed, superheated, and formed into the shape and then machined to what it needs to be for the final machining requirement. Now, aside from this just being a stronger connecting rod, both from a material standpoint and a physical standpoint from the actual neck of this being thicker, the Manley also uses a stronger bolt. These are, I want to say these are either ARP 2000 or L19 bolts, and what you're going to get is a stronger clamping force out of that versus what you would get out of a factory normal 12mm bolt holding these together. So in the long run, what you're going to get out of a forged connecting rod or an aftermarket connecting rod for a built block versus stock block is this is going to, it's going to take to higher cylinder pressure. It's going to take a lot more force to bend and disform this connecting rod versus this. Now, I'm not saying that it's impossible to do that to this, because you can deform and you can break these connecting rods. It just takes a lot more force to be able to do so. And when you have certain detonation events that may be so strong, it can destroy and bend and when you destroy a connecting rod, you end up with a lot of damage inside of an engine. So from a built engine standpoint, this is obviously going to be a stronger option. You can withstand some decent abuse on these, but like I said, with a lot of factory engine components on stock blocks, you are really only one bad detonation event from having a really bad day and a pretty big hole in your pocket. Now, aside from connecting rods and pistons, the other thing that I do want to talk about is the crankshaft. Now, this is a OEM STI crankshaft. These have been salt bath nitrided. These are really good crankshafts from the factory. And to be honest, most built engines you're going to see are going to utilize these stock crankshafts. You may see some aftermarket ones out there from like Cali's. I think Manley makes some of these also, and a couple other people make forged versions of these crankshafts. But what you're going to see on, I'd say realistically, probably 80% of the built engines is going to be an OEM STI crankshaft. They're already forged, they're already heat treated. These are good options for people to use. I use these in a lot of my own built engines as well. I don't think I've used an aftermarket crankshaft in really any engine I've built, because there really hasn't been a demand for it. If you're to the point where you're making so much power where you need a full billet crankshaft, at that point, you are not even in the realm of looking at stock block options. So just to cover the crankshaft, this is a good option for built engines. If you come across an engine using one of these factory crankshafts, don't bat an eye on it. This is a good thing. Now, aside from crankshafts, rods, and pistons, the other thing we're going to talk about is bearings. Now, I do have some aftermarket new bearings, but are there any in any of my connecting rods? I don't think so. I don't want to crack open a brand new thing of bearings because I use those for engine builds and I don't want them to get contaminated. But the bearings on Subarus, they don't necessarily die because they want to die. They typically die because there's an oil pressure issue. Now, on this bearing here, it's starting to get a little bit of scoring rudder in this oil journal on the inside of it. And what happens is people will run too thin of oil. They will overheat their oil. They'll run low on oil. Subarus already have oiling issues with factory oil pump screws backing out, and PCV issues, sloshing in the oil pan, old school cracked pickups, which you don't see too often anymore. So it's not necessarily just a bearing issue, it's more of an oil pressure issue or an oil issue inside of the engine. So bearing wise, I don't use these in any built engines. For the most part, I use King bearings. They're XPG Pro coated ones, but bearing wise, I mean, they're bearings. The big problem is mainly oil. Now, I don't have a closed decked engine here, but you guys have seen them in the past on this channel. The other big factor with stock block cars, if you're shooting for big power, are the cylinder walls right here and the cylinder liners. These are pretty thin in comparison to a lot of other engines out there. Now, what we typically do and what other people will do is that we will machine a closed deck insert to fill out most of these water jackets around the actual cylinders. And what that does is just help provide some more cylinder support up here. When you start making a lot of power and you start pushing a lot of boost through these, what can happen is you will crack these cylinder liners and you will start letting coolant from these coolant jackets into here, and it will act like a blown head gasket. It will look like a blown head gasket, but at the end of the day, what actually happened is you cracked the actual liner, coolant's getting in, combustion gas is getting out, and you're just not gonna have a fun time. These will rust really quickly when you start filling these up with coolant also, if oil can't get in here to protect them from rusting. So that's the other big thing. There are people who sleeve these as well. You can sleeve EJs. I typically see the closed deck option being more used than the sleeving, but sleeving is a strong possibility and a lot of people do it with a lot of success. It's just the closed decking option is a lot more frequent and you'll see that a lot more. Out front is typically where I go to get all of my closed deck options. They have a V3 and a V4 option. The only difference in that V3 to V4 is just the thickness of the material that gets pressed in here. They do not put material all the way down in here. They only put it in, I want to say it's a 1/4 of an inch or something like that. Don't quote me on it because I'm not 100% sure how thick that insert is, but they'll push the insert in and then they will mill this flat so that way you have a perfect surface. Now, I guess while we're here, the last thing that we can touch on is head gaskets because you can see the outline of it here. Now, with head gaskets and stock head bolts, when you start making too much boost and you start increasing the cylinder pressure in here, because you got to remember cylinder pressure is boost and compression ratio, what essentially what's going to happen is if the clamping force of the stock head bolt is exceeded, what's going to happen is you're going to start lifting the head away from the block a little bit because that pressure is trying to escape. When that pressure escapes, it's going to get into the cooling jacket between the head gasket and between the head and slide in here, and then that's when you're going to see head gasket failures. And that's just another fault of stock blocks with the OEM head bolts, if that's something you're using. Now you can use something like a head stud ARP 2000s, which will give you just a little bit more clamping force than the factory head bolt on here. You'll thread the stud in there, you'll slide the head on, you'll put the washer down, you'll put the nut down, and you'll torque it down in sequence. And that will help to a degree with keeping the head down. But if you're shooting for big power stuff, stock blocks really are not the option for you long term. It's not going to be reliable if you're going to be beating on the car every single day. But a 1/2 inch stud or a 14mm stud is going to give you way more clamping force across this head than an 11mm like these ARPs or even the factory head bolts, if that matters. So those are the main weak points of what you're going to run into with using a factory block. So I've shown you guys the differences between an OEM engine and aftermarket components. Now, at what point do you go from a factory engine to a built engine? Well, that's really up to you. Like I said, there's many factors that dictate how long a factory engine will live when you start pushing it and making power on it. Tune, setup, fuel type, how you drive are really the main factors there. I would say if you are planning to make anywhere north of 400 wheel horsepower, just do yourself the solid and go to a built engine. If you want to run your stock engine and you have a contingency plan and you already have a built engine set aside, by all means use that factory engine if you want to, but don't expect it to last forever. I personally will run stock engines up to 450 wheel horsepower until they decide to die. I have not had one die quite yet. I've had one factory engine at 450 horsepower on pump gas that was using an FB Black that I had in my old 05 STI. I put about 15,000 miles on that engine, and then now it is living life in a Legacy GT, and I think it has another 40 to 50,000 miles on it since going on that engine. So if you treat stock blocks right and you have them set up right and you have them tuned right, they definitely can last. If you're gonna be doing any heavy track driving, any competitive driving, a lot of spirited driving, and you're gonna be abusing the car a lot more, I would say definitely opt for the built engine just to save yourself the heartache from having to do an engine swap later on if you can avoid it. Oh, like I said, I'm not going to tell you when you should or when you shouldn't, if you should or if you shouldn't use a built engine. I think they both have their place and I think they can both be used properly, but after showing you guys the differences, I hope you can kind of make that decision for yourself. Like I said, personally, I will use a stock engine up to 450 wheel horsepower. I've seen some stock engines at 600 plus that have been going for around 2 years. It's a daily driver car that gets an occasional pull here and there, and the car is pretty much, I mean, it's still kicking, still living life. So these 800, 1000, 1200 horsepower stock block cars you see, they are intended just for enjoyment, for video use, and it's not something that we suggest you guys honestly do. Obviously, you're gonna take out your cylinder heads, you're gonna take out your engine, you're gonna take out your cam gears, you're gonna take out a lot of oiling stuff that you're gonna have to replace. Replacing these engines, it's not necessarily a cheap thing when you decide to have, or not when you, but when your car, I guess, decides to have massive bearing failure and sends metal through oil and just destroys everything. You're looking at minimum like 10 to 12K for like a proper rebuild at that point. So the decision is ultimately yours, my friends. Engine health is also going to play a huge factor like we talked about at the beginning of the video, but I hope this answers your guys' questions. If you do have any additional questions, feel free to toss them down below and I will try my best to answer them, and I'm sure the community will jump in as well. But with that, that's all I've got for you guys on this one. So if you liked the video, if it helped you, go ahead and hit that like button, turn it black, blue, green, yellow, purple, silver, sight, and whatever color it turns for you. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel and you want to be, because we're going to be turning this old 2.5 RS into a 22B. That engine that we just took apart is actually the new heart for this car. It's going down to out front to get closed decked. So with that, that's all I got for you guys on this one. So peace out, homies.